The silence in my own home was a heavy living thing. It had settled into the walls, into the very air I breathed, a constant suffocating reminder of the world that had been stolen from me. In the weeks that followed my final confrontation with Mark at my doorstep, I existed in a state of strange suspension. The legal machinery was grinding forward. A distant earthquake I could feel only through the formal letters from my lawyer and the occasional, frantic email from Omnicorp's legal team, their tone shifting from arrogant to conciliatory to desperate. But in my day-to-day life there was only the quiet. Sarah moved through the house with a careful grace, her eyes often finding mine, filled with a question I didn't yet know how to answer. What now? The war was over. The enemy was vanquished. But the battlefield was a desolate place, littered with the wreckage of a decade of friendship and a lifetime of assumptions. I had proven my point to the world. I had exposed the lie. I had taken the shattered pieces of my legacy and held them up for all to see. But now, holding those pieces, I felt not triumph but a profound and echoing emptiness. The ghost I had become to defeat Mark now had no purpose, and I didn't know how to become a man again. My old office, the one with the whiteboards chronicling my meticulous revenge, felt like a tomb. I couldn't bring myself to go in there. The sight of my own intricate plans, the maps of servers, the timelines leading to Nexus, it all felt like the artifacts of a different person, a vengeful spirit who had possessed me for a year. I had been so singularly focused on the act of destruction that I had given no thought to what would come after. The blueprint for my life ended at the moment of the trap springing. There was no page 2, so I drifted. I would wake up, make coffee, and sit in my living room, staring out the window at a world that had continued to turn without me. The seasons were beginning to change. The fierce heat of summer was giving way to the crisp golden light of early autumn. It felt like a mockery. How could the world be so beautiful when my internal landscape was still so scarred and gray? The first crack in the silence came from an unexpected place. My hands. For over a year they had known only the feel of a keyboard, the click of a mouse, the dry marker on a whiteboard. They were the tools of a digital phantom. But one afternoon, I found myself in the backyard, looking at the small, neglected garden Sarah had tried to maintain. Weeds had choked out the flowers. The soil was hard and cracked. Without really thinking, I went to the garage, found an old trowel and a pair of worn gloves, and knelt on the earth. The sensation was jarring. The cool, damp soil under my knees, the rough texture of the gloves, the simple physical effort of pulling a weed, root, and all, from the ground. It was real. It was tangible. There was no code here, no hidden back doors, no layers of deception. There was only cause and effect. You pull a weed, you clear space. You water the soil, something might grow. It was the most honest work I had done in years. I spent hours out there, until my back ached and my knees were stained with dirt. Sarah came out and watched me for a long time, not saying a word. When I finally came inside, she simply handed me a glass of water, her smile small but real. It was a start. The legal conclusion, when it finally arrived, was anticlimactic in its sterile, legalistic way. It came in the form of a thick packet of paper delivered by a courier. My lawyer called minutes later, his voice buzzing with a triumph I couldn't quite feel. Omnicorp had capitulated. Completely. The settlement was everything we could have possibly asked for. All patents related to Aegis were officially and permanently transferred back into my name. The remaining assets of the shell company that had held Aegis were signed over to me. A significant financial payment, enough to ensure we would never have to worry about money again. It was a total victory. I hung up the phone and looked at the stack of papers on my kitchen table. It represented the restoration of everything I had lost. My name, my work, my financial security. So why did it feel like I was looking at the ghost of my old life? Neatly bound in a legal document, I realized then that you can never truly go back. The river of time only flows one way. The Alex who had co-founded Aegis with his best friend was gone, irrevocably altered by the betrayal. To simply try and step back into that old skin would be to live a lie almost as profound as Mark's. The money was a tool, a resource. The patents were my intellectual property, the proof of my authorship. But they were not my future. They were the headstone on a grave. I needed to build a new house, not just reclaim the ruins of the old one. This realization settled over me not as a sadness but as a form of liberation. The past was finally officially over. I was free to decide what came next. It was Sarah who inadvertently gave me the direction. We were having dinner, talking about nothing in particular, when she mentioned an article she'd read about a small rural hospital system that had been crippled by a ransomware attack. Their patient records were locked, their appointment systems frozen. They couldn't afford the ransom, and they certainly couldn't afford the kind of enterprise-level security software that companies like Omnicorp sold. "It's just not right," she said, her voice filled with a quiet anger. "Those are people's lives. They shouldn't be defenseless." I went to bed that night, but I couldn't sleep. Her words echoed in my mind. Defenseless. I had spent my career building shields for corporations that could already afford armies. I had created Aegis to protect data, but somewhere along the way, that data had become just another commodity, another asset on a balance sheet. The original dream, the pure idea of creating a digital sanctuary, had been lost in the rush towards buyouts and billion-dollar valuations. The next morning, I went back into my old office for the first time without a sense of dread. I looked at the whiteboards not as battle plans but as relics. With a clean cloth, I started to wipe them clean. The complex diagrams of server architectures, the timelines, the lists of Mark's vulnerabilities, they all smeared and vanished under my hand, leaving behind a blank, green slate. It was a cathartic, necessary erasure. When the boards were clean, I picked up a fresh blue marker. At the top of the largest board, I wrote a single word: sanctuary. And then I began to write again. Not code, not yet, but ideas, principles, a manifesto for a new kind of project. This would not be a company. There would be no CEOs, no VCs, no acquisition targets. It would be a foundation, a non-profit. Its mission would be simple: to build robust open-source digital security tools for the public good. For libraries, for local governments, for hospitals, for non-profits, for the institutions that formed the backbone of our society, but were constantly vulnerable because they lacked the resources of a Fortune 500 company. There would be no patents. Every line of code would be open for anyone to see, to use, to improve upon. The weapon I had forged in secrecy would now be dismantled and its parts used to build a public park. The irony was not lost on me. The very secrecy that had been the key to my revenge would be the first thing I jettisoned in my new life. There would be no shadows here. Only light. The work was slow, deliberate. I hired a small, carefully selected team. Not the slickest coders from the best schools, but passionate, idealistic engineers who believed in the mission. We worked out of a small, bright office space that smelled of coffee and whiteboard markers. Not corporate anxiety. The pace was human. We took breaks. We talked about our families. The pressure was not to meet a quarterly earnings report or a launch date for a shareholder meeting. The pressure was to get it right, because real people depended on it. I found myself rediscovering the joy of programming, the pure, unadulterated pleasure of solving a complex problem for its own sake, for the good it could do. It was the feeling I'd had in the garage with Mark, before the money and the fame and the betrayal had poisoned it all. I was, in a way, coming home. About 6 months into the Foundation's work, we got our first major test. A coordinated phishing attack targeted several city governments in our state. Our system, which we had quietly installed for them a few months prior, flagged the malicious emails and neutralized them before they could do any damage. One of the city managers, a weary-sounding man named Carl, called me personally. "I don't know what you folks did," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "but you just saved our city a world of hurt. We'd have been shut down for weeks." I thanked him and hung up. I sat at my desk for a long time, staring at the phone. There was no media coverage. No stock price jumped. No one in a boardroom was popping champagne. But in that moment, I felt a sense of accomplishment deeper and more meaningful than any I had ever felt after a successful product launch at Aegis. This was the mirror I should have been looking into all along. Not one that reflected an enemy's downfall, but one that reflected a life of purpose. The money from the settlement, which had felt so abstract and tainted, now had a clear purpose. It funded the Foundation. It paid the salaries of my team. It allowed us to provide our tools and services for free forever. The wealth that had been born from a betrayal was now being used to build a fortress of goodwill. It was the final act of alchemy, turning the lead of that painful experience into something of genuine value. I thought of Mark less and less. He became a distant figure, a character from a book I had read long ago. I heard through the industry grapevine that the lawsuits had finally bankrupted him. Omnicorp, to recoup their losses and distance themselves from the scandal, had pursued him with a vengeance that made my own revenge look almost gentle. He had lost his home, his cars, everything. He had moved to another state, and no one seemed to know what he was doing now. The news should have brought me some sense of schadenfreude, but it didn't. It just felt sad. The great Mark Shields, the charismatic visionary, had been reduced to a footnote, a cautionary tale in the annals of corporate greed. The fire of anger I had carried for so long was completely extinguished, and in its place was a cool, quiet pity. He was a prisoner of his own choices, and that was a life sentence I wouldn't wish on anyone. My indifference was the final, absolute proof that I was free. One evening I was working late at the Foundation's office. The rest of the team had gone home. The only light came from my monitor and the distant glow of the city through the large window. I was debugging a particularly stubborn piece of code for a new encryption module we were designing for public school databases. It was a challenging, fascinating problem, and I was lost in the flow of it the way I used to get in the early days. I didn't hear Sarah come in. I only felt her hand on my shoulder, making me jump. "You're going to strain your eyes," she said softly, placing a takeout bag from our favorite Thai place on the desk. I leaned back, rubbing my face. "Just trying to crack this last part. It's for the school project." She came around the desk and looked at the lines of code scrolling down my screen. She didn't understand any of it, but she smiled. "It looks like you're home," she said. Her words struck me with a force that was both gentle and profound. Home. This wasn't a place. It wasn't the high-rise office of Aegis or the garage where it started, or even the house we lived in. Home was this state of being. It was the peace of doing work that mattered to me on my own terms. It was the safety of a love that had weathered the worst storm imaginable. It was the quiet confidence that came from knowing who I was, scars and all. I looked around the small, modest office, at the whiteboards filled with ideas that would never make anyone rich but might just keep someone safe, at the empty desks of a team I trusted and respected, at the woman I loved who had never stopped believing in the man I was beneath the pain. This was the life I had built from the ashes. It was a different life, a better one, a wiser one. The best revenge wasn't living well, and it wasn't the mirror I had held up to Mark, showing him his own monstrous reflection. Those things were just stages on the journey. The best revenge, I finally understood, was freedom. The freedom to walk away from the ruins without a single backward glance. The freedom to build something new and beautiful. Not on the foundation of your pain, but on the bedrock of your own rediscovered values. The freedom to be quiet, to be a planner, to be who you are without apology or the need for an enemy to define you. He used my own secret weapon to try and destroy me, but in the end I used it to build myself a sanctuary. And from within the strong, silent walls of that sanctuary, I learned the most important lesson of all. The ultimate justice isn't in the spectacular downfall of your enemy. It's in the profound, unshakable peace you find when you realize their shadow no longer has the power to darken your door. The echo of their betrayal finally fades, and in the silence that remains, you hear only the sound of your own life. Finally and completely your own. And that is a victory no one can ever take away.